Hello, everyone, and hopefully welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Mundy. That's me, Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation. So it's early in the new year, and we had some fun last week with skee ball, and we'll have some fun this week too, I hope. Uh, this week we're going to talk about another pairing of people, if you will. I'm calling this episode The Odd Couple, and I think you'll find it very interesting to see who the couple is. And hopefully I keep you all guessing. So let's just get right down to business, shall we? Okay. All right. I'm going to do my screen share as I always do. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. And I know you can see some of that. And as long and until that happens, and then I hit that. Okay. All right. Everybody ready for this one? Okay. So the odd couple and the Empire State Building. I bet you're wondering what this means, huh? Well, let's find out. No. Who did that? Who stuck that slide in there? Geez, that's not it. But when we think of the odd couple, I certainly think of Jack Klugman and Tony Randall, because after all, that's my generation. I can't avoid it, and I've got to admit it, so what the heck. But that's not who I have in mind. This is the couple that I have in mind. Okay, so on the left, we have Pierre Samuel DuPont, and on the right, we have John Jakob Raskob. So how did they get to be the odd couple? And what's the story? Let's start, shall we? And we're starting with Pierre DuPont. Now, regretfully, Mr. DuPont was never remembered like many of his cousins were, but he himself was not, which leaves, obviously, then Raskob would become a member, and that's why we're telling the story. So, but DuPont himself, you can see, born in 1870 outside of Wilmington, obviously into an incredibly already wealthy family that was begun. The E.I. DuPont Company begun by his great-grandfather, Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, in 1802. So young Pierre went to MIT, bright, smart young man, graduated with a degree in chemical engineering. So obviously he had a brain. And guess where he went to work when he graduated? You guessed right, DuPont. But he wasn't happy there. He found it a very stodgy, old-fashioned, and a not well-run company. He just didn't like it. And he had inherited $100,000 worth of stock from one of his cousins, uncle, in the Johnson Steel Company based in Lorain, Ohio, which is just west of Cleveland, Lake Erie. And he was invited to help participate in basically the dissolution of the company. And so he went out to work for Johnson Steel in 1898, and his job was to liquidate the non-steel assets. And so he's out there then at that point in time, and he will stay there until 1902, because actually 1901, 1902, because it was in 1902, and this is him as a younger man, a little older man. All right, it was in 1902, he and his cousins Alfred and Coleman would end up kind of taking over the DuPont Company. Their uncle, Eugène Irénée himself, had died, and the three of them would take over the company, basically buy it from falling into non-family hands. And so he will now become involved in the day-to-day management of E.I. DuPont, and he was a good manager. He helped modernize the company in all of its different operations, whether it's manufacturing end or just the operations end. And so he was busy doing that. In 1915, he is going to buy his cousin Coleman's shares in the DuPont Company, consolidating his ownership in it with some investors. And his cousin Alfred would sue because he didn't want that to happen, but he would lose. And so Pierre is now going to become the head of E.I. DuPont and Company and start running it. All right. Pretty important stuff. Now, in the same year, 1915, he is also elected to the board of General Motors out in Michigan. And at this point, the two will be entwined for the next, 30 years, the two companies, right? And Pierre himself. So 1915, he's on the board. The owner, William DuPont, was poorly running it, and in 1920, Pierre would be encouraged to buy the stock Bertrand Durant. I'm sorry, I said Dumont, but it's William Durant. And he would now become the president of General Motors Company. And in 1923, he would become its chairman. And he would stay as chairman until 1928 when he would resign for a very interesting reason that we'll get into when we talk about Raskob. And as you can imagine now, with one foot in the DuPont company and the other foot in General Motors, Pierre Samuel DuPont is becoming one of the great industrial titans in America at this point in time. So much so that he was put on the front cover of Time magazine in January of 1927, because at this point, General Motors is about to become the world's largest corporation. And he's the chairman of the board. He's making it run. So pretty neat stuff there, right? I think so. All right. So let's get to the other half of the odd couple. All right. And that's this fellow, John Jakob Raskob. Opposite story. I mean, it's like night and day. John Jakob Raskob was born in Lockport, New York in 1879. Lockport is just outside of Buffalo. He was second generation American German. His mother was Irish, but his grandfather, Raskob, was an immigrant from Germany. John's father, John, owned a cigar manufacturing company in Lockport, made them, smoked them, and stuff like that. And when young John was, 1898, so he's 19 years old, his father would die from liver failure. And John, even though at this point he had graduated from high school, a Catholic high school, because the Raskobs were Catholic, and he had gone to the Clark Business School in Buffalo for 1 year, thinking he wanted to go into business. He now leaves school and goes to work to help support the family. And even though the family was not maybe not quite comfortably middle class, but still not in too bad a shape. But nonetheless, he goes to work in a local law firm as a clerk. And it's clear very early that he is the smartest one in the room. Okay. So Raskob was a bright young man at the same time. But he had bigger and better ambitions than that. And so he would eventually work for a manufacturing company in Lockport. And that would take him to another job in Lorain, Ohio, surprisingly enough, okay, because he's going to go up the corporate ladder. And in Lorain, Ohio, he is introduced to Pierre DuPont. DuPont is looking for an assistant, secretary, basically. Raskob, who was never shy and always very confident in his abilities, suggested that he was the right guy for the job. And furthermore, that he deserved to make $80 a month, which was higher than the median average income for Americans at that point in time. So pretty gutsy guy. Regretfully, though, Pierre didn't hire him at that point in time. Instead, he suggested that John Jakob Raskob go work in Sydney, Nova Scotia for the former president of Johnson Steel, a guy named Arthur Moxham. And Moxham was now running Dominion Steel. And Moxham hired him. And through his own, shall we say, innate salesmanship, he convinced Moxham to raise his salary from $80 a month to $100 a month. And this is in Canada, in Sydney, Canada, in Nova Scotia. So you can see what kind of a personality that Raskob has. And Raskob was just an attentive student at Moxham's feet, because Moxham was considered one of the best steel managers in Canada or America. And it was the lessons that I think that Raskob learned working for Moxham at Dominion that he would then use for the rest of his life in building his career with DuPont and, as we'll see, with General Motors. So Raskob would visit his mother in 1901, and she, as mothers would do, son, can you move a little closer to home? Because he's 1,000 miles away at this point. It's a 3-day train ride to go from Buffalo to Sydney, Nova Scotia. And so he relents, and he comes back to the States, and he ends up back at Lorain, Ohio, at Johnson Steel, surprisingly enough. And there, this time, DuPont hires him as his personal secretary. And that's really where it all began. So that's 1901. So in 1900, as we've heard already at this point, Pierre DuPont is going to become very much engaged in running E.I. DuPont and Company. And the two of them, Raskob and DuPont, create this really truly odd couple. I mean, let's see. Here we have this patrician industrialist from Wilmington, and as basically a blue collar, second generation German immigrant, had a high school education, and that's it. And the two of them are going to become one of the most powerful forces in American industrial history in the first half of the 19th century. Okay, so 1911, Raskob is made the assistant treasurer for DuPont. In 10 years' time, he's gone from personal secretary to assistant treasurer in one of the largest corporations in America. All right. In 1914, 3 years later, he is made the treasurer for DuPont. All right. Okay. And then in 1918, right. And keep in mind, remember, 1915 is when Pierre DuPont becomes a board member at General Motors. Right. Okay. So in 1918, Raskob now becomes the vice president for finance for both E.I. DuPont and General Motors Corporation. And a heck of a life to lead at this point in time, right? So Raskob becomes, if you will, kind of like Pierre DuPont's Jiminy Cricket. He sits on the shoulder and says, Pierre, you want to look at buying some GM stock. It's going to do pretty well, I think, because in the meantime, Raskob's buying it himself. And luckily for both of them, as I mentioned earlier, William Durant gets himself in financial trouble and has to sell his assets in the company that Pierre, the DuPont buys, and becomes the majority owner of General Motors. And there is John Jakob Raskob, been nice and pretty to take advantage of the whole thing. And now he's the vice president for finance for GM and DuPont. And in 1919, Raskob made a very important decision. He joined the Union League of Philadelphia, and he would stay a member until 1938. Pretty neat stuff there, okay? But that's not where the story ends. And you may remember, though, we talked about Raskob back in October when we were talking about American presidential elections. So hopefully you can reference that to find out a little bit more about Raskob from a different perspective, perhaps. All right. So things are going well for Raskob. Let's see. He is a young man. Very handsome young kid, isn't he? All right. And then this is him as a more middle-aged man, because our story goes up to 1928 at this point. In 1928, Raskob becomes surprising everybody. He becomes the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Politically, he put himself, I think, more or less as a middle-of-the-roader, but he was a Republican up until now, by and large. It's who he's affiliated with. And that would cause a split with Alfred Sloan, who had become the chairman of, or the president of General Motors Corporation. And because Sloan was an incredibly conservative Republican, and he just despised Raskob, and so he pushes Raskob out, and Raskob resigns. And when Raskob goes, so goes Pierre DuPont. So what happens next in our story? Well, let's take a look. All right, here we go. So from there, that's Raskob on the left-hand side. And that is Alfred E. Smith on the right-hand side, because Alfred E. Smith was the Democratic presidential candidate in the 1928 election. And he lost. All right. But he and Raskob were good friends. And the one thing they really had in common, more so I think than the politics, was their faith. And this is at a time in American history when Catholics weren't going very high up any ladder at all at this point in time. So they formed a relationship as well, because in 1928, well, let's go. Let me do this. Right. I went too far. Darn it. All right. So what's going to happen? So it's late 1920s, New York City. There is a big competition to build the tallest skyscraper in New York City. New York is just flush with real estate developers. Who's going to build the biggest building? All right, because at this point in time, New York already had some of the biggest, tallest buildings in the country, if not the world. And Walter Chrysler Corporation, decided that he would build the tallest skyscraper in New York City as a monument to himself, which is why called the Chrysler Building. Now, keep it. Now, here comes John Jakob Raskob, who was no slouch intellectually, financially, or anything else. But he had an ego. Let's face it. You don't do what he did without having a lot of confidence in yourself and a good, strong, healthy ego. And in August of 1929, he announces that he's going to form something called the Empire State Incorporated. And how did he get around to doing that? Well, let's see. By the way, this is the Chrysler building, right? Because Chrysler said he wanted to build the tallest skyscraper, and Raskob says, no, I'm going to do it instead. So this is the old Waldorf Astoria Hotel. It was on 30, it was on between 33rd and 34th. Owned by obviously the Astor family. Although surprisingly, in 1928, Coleman DuPont had bought the lease from the business itself, but the Astor still owned the property. But in the meantime, everything in New York had moved uptown, as well as the new Waldorf Astoria Hotel. So this building was purchased by the Bethlehem Engineering Company, headed by a fellow named Floyd Brown. In early 1929, Brown had planned to build a 25-story skyscraper, not much of a skyscraper, when you think about it. He never got his financing straightened out. He eventually went bankrupt. And along comes John Jakob Raskob and this Empire State Incorporated, right? And they're going to buy the property from Brown, and they're going to build the world's tallest skyscraper instead. All right. So who were these partners in this Empire State? I'll give you three guesses, and the first two don't count, right? Pierre DuPont and his cousin Coleman. So it's always who you know, isn't it? It makes sense in this world. And so with one or two other investors, Empire State begins the process of creating the Empire State Building. All right? Okay. All right. They hire the firm of Shreve, Land, and Harmon. William Harmon will become the chief architect for the building. This is one of his plans. All right. And it is going to be taller and taller and taller. Now, because of New York's zoning laws, you have these different setbacks, so the building couldn't be straight up. And actually, take a look at this design here, because the story has it that Raskob, including Raskob, with his own money, by and large, but with help from, obviously, the other investors, he was taking on this project. And Raskob is the chairman of this company. He's running it. Don't make any mistake about that. This is his building, his idea, it's his building. And the story goes that he went to Lamb and said, he says, Bill, takes a pencil, puts it on the desk. Can you build a building like this? And that's where the idea came. Although actually Lamb had already built a building in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, that looks something similar to this, but on a much smaller scale. And that's probably where Lamb got the idea, obviously. So here we go. So they demolished. So in April, they buy the property, and in October, they already own the land, and they have demolished the building itself, the old Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And in December, they started construction pretty fast. So what happened in between? The Depression, October, right, 1829. But Raskob, and if any of you have a little German in you, like I do, you know that you get a little bit of stubbornness in there, right? So Raskob wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let the Depression stop him from building the world's tallest skyscraper. And so he moves on. Again, because he had some pockets, as did the DuPonts, Pierre DuPont. With a loan, let's face it, from the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, $27 million, they marched on. And they just kept on going and going and going. So here you can see the progression of the building. They used some incredibly sophisticated managerial operations, logistical operations for getting this thing built in such short time. Richard Shreve in the firm was well known for his ability to manage projects. And you can see how quickly this went up. So in June, just 6 months after they started construction, you can see it from the far left, July. I mean, they were, and then July again. I mean, just between the 7th and the 24th, in 2 weeks, see how much far they've gotten. They were building 4 floors a week, which was revolutionary. Nobody else was doing it. And so we go on and on and on. So we go to August, September, and then November on the right-hand side. And you can see again how how it just gets taller and taller and taller. And in if you look off to the right, you'll see the Chrysler building, just a few blocks away to the northeast. Right. Here we are under construction again. And again, what an impressive building. I mean, it still is. And that's the finished building itself. Now, Chrysler, Chrysler first heard that the Empire State Building was going to be 1,000 feet high, then Chrysler moved his another 100 feet up. And then Raskob retaliated by building his and by adding another couple of stories and things like that. So the Chrysler building ended up being about 1,050 feet, but the Empire State Building would be 1,250. So Raskob won the race, as you can imagine, because I think Raskob was not going to be denied. So isn't that fascinating that the Union League member built the Empire State Building? Okay, pretty neat. So, all right. So here we go, May the 1st, 1931, all right? They expected the whole project to take 20 months. The construction project took 18. It opened up 45 days earlier than expected. That's how sophisticated the whole project was in terms of from its management to its actual construction. Art Deco building, just magnificent stuff. That's the lobby. And here we can see how it became the world's largest skyscraper. And if you look on the right-hand side, the second building from the right in 1908, the Metropolitan Tower, that was, in a sense, for the audience here, we're all about Philadelphia. Up until 1908, the country's largest building was City Hall, right? Okay. And it was designed to be the tallest building in the country, but because it took so long to build the darn thing, it took 30 years, its claim to fame only lasted, from 1901 to 1908 when it was surpassed by the Metropolitan Building. If you look into the left, at the far left, of course, you'll see there were two buildings in 1930. Chrysler, third from left, and then the Empire State Building on the far left-hand side. Okay. All right. Here's a modern view of it. All right. And here we have the odd couple themselves again, right? They stayed friends all of their lives. It's just hard to imagine. It was more than a friendship. I think it really was. But it's an incredible relationship. And because of it, Philadelphia was better, the league was better because of Mr. Raskob being a member. And the world certainly got one of its great buildings of all time. So who would have thought that the Union League of Philadelphia would have been the club of the gentleman who would eventually build the Empire State Building? And not only that, but geez, he was the vice president of finance, DuPont and General Motors, and just this blue-collar kid from Lockport, New York. It's a pure Union League story. You gotta love it. So I hope you enjoyed all that. I hope it made sense. I left a lot out. That was just the tip of the iceberg. There's tons more I can talk about in terms of the relationship between the two of them and what they did and what they good stuff. So I hope you all look into it at some point in time. So I think I probably took longer than I should have. I apologize. Forgive me. I'll probably do it again, but hopefully next week's will be shorter. We'll see what happens. And in the meantime, until next week, another shout out to and I forgot to mention, we have a Union League member, Pat McGrory, who is the grandson of John Jakob Raskob on his mother's side. And Pat's a great guy. I hope if you're a league member, I hope you get to know him at some point. He really is. And you can see the Raskob in him. Literally, he looks like a Raskob too. So all right. So I was about to say, shout out to the Union League Legacy Foundation for sponsoring these weekly videos and episodes. I hope everybody's enjoying them. And until next week, everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and stay well. And we'll see you next week. Goodbye.